don't hate on it unnecessarily just because you feel like it.
I will say you will like Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace if you just want to talk shit about a movie and you're drunk.
I mean, how much more could you possibly fuck up the entire backstory to Star Wars?
Like I said in the last video, you have to be brainwashed into liking these movies. I know this because I was brainwashed.
But it also makes all of Lucas's topical and timely takes on news of the decade more or less meaningless.
Performances and also the relationships and the charisma between the cast, none of that mattered.
First reactions can be very brutal or a blessing. In the case of the Phantom Menace, it received a very brutal outburst. You see, when looking at the reviews on IMDb and Rotten Tomatoes, it doesn't look all that bad. But once you really take a deep dive into the reactions, it's like entering hell for the first time and seeing the fire that's lit into George Lucas's vision. Now, the film didn't hit the same mark A New Hope did, but certain aspects were definitely blown out of proportion. And I don't mean that lightly, I mean blown like a nuke being dropped in the Sahara Desert. Star Wars is a big IP. Original trilogy set the bar high, and George Lucas had a promise to fill, giving a wider view to the rise of Darth Vader, easily the most iconic villain in the history of fucking cinema. Well, how was the reaction, you may say? Let's see our old pal Bob here.
What's that name say? Jake Lloyd. What if go to hell?
The fans were so heated that they took their anger beyond the characters themselves and went after the actors playing them. Jake Lloyd, the actor who played Anakin Skywalker, his life went pretty much downhill after this film, getting bullied constantly to the point he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Ahmed Best, the actor who played Jar Jar Binks, was almost sent to the brink of suicide, and George Lucas himself received constant messages of him ruining fans' childhood. Reading back on this is some pretty fucked up shit. It's a common trend in the Star Wars fandom. If you produce well a film that is not on the nose for most Star Wars fans, they won't just critique your writing and characters, but they will go after the actors themselves.
Oh, not good.
Because they don't realize that actors have no part in the writing process.
You want to go home and rethink your life?
I want to go home and rethink my life.
Well, unless you're Edward Norton. But the point is, don't be a douchebag because a certain space film didn't meet your expectations. Me and Star Wars go way back, way before the Clone Wars, which was released in... Let me check for a sec, okay. Oh wow. Wow, that show is that old. Holy Jesus. Empire Strikes Back being the first ever Star Wars film I've seen, I was fascinated to see this world that's beyond my belief. Getting older, being fascinated more with storytelling, there's a reason the original trilogy is so looked upon. It took a concept and executed brilliantly. Now, for the prequels, the best you can describe them is a great concept with a rough execution. The Phantom Menace was the Kickstarter for Anakin Skywalker's life before his descent to the dark side. George Lucas had many fans with high hopes, and well, the Phantom Menace gave a very mediocre result. If you hate politics, well, hate to break it to you, this film is nothing but politics. But no way is it a bad thing if it does, just depends on how you make it clear to your audience watching. The film begins with the Trade Federation creating a blockade around Naboo, after the taxation on trade routes around the star systems. New Gunray is trying to enforce a blockage of any shipping towards Naboo, pretty much the government's way of protesting. Chancellor Valorum, I'm just gonna call him Vacuum. Chancellor Vacuum sends Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi as ambassadors. Whoa, what? Ambassadors? If you're gonna send ambassadors in the form of Jedi without informing New Gunray of this matter, what are you trying to gain by this? If you're trying to pull off a trickery, these are horrible disguises. What the fuck? Oh well, I guess.
This is impossible!
Gunray sends troops to kill the Jedi Knights, but that certainly doesn't play out too well as the film pulls out the "hey, that would've been useful here" card, because they needed to get our heroes out of a dire situation. Do we see this move again? No, it's Star Wars. This stuff is like the scapegoat when they can't cleverly write something else. Sidious is pissed off that his plans have been accelerated early and orders Gunray to legally invade Naboo. Qui and Obi-Wan, being geniuses, enter the invasion transports, and this is where we run into the film's biggest problem. Jar Jar Binks in this film is pretty much your typical comedic relief character, but the thing is, he's in this film for way too long. Whether if it was blatant at a dinner table,
Don't do that again.
in the background, he's just there, well, being Jar Jar Binks. Jar Jar escorts the two to Gungan City and they warn Boss Nass of the invasion, but Boss Nass doesn't want to leave as he believes they'll never attack underwater.
I've taken over the last pockets of primitive life forms. ships. We are in complete control.
Well then, Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan, and Jar Jar escape the waters and free the captured queen. They easily manage to get through the droid army and hijack a Naboo royal starship, but run into a trouble as their shields have been damaged. Now their ship is in complete idle mode. Probably would have been a strategic move for the Trade Federation, to send boarding parties towards the ship. I mean, it's clearly not working that like 10 something Trade Federation ships can't hit one target that is just standing there. This is so stupid. So the ship is on low fuel to make it to Coruscant, and the nearest planet that's off the Trade Federation's radar is Tatooine. Imagine those odds. Yes, they run into Anakin Skywalker, who's a slave working for Watto. And he's not just one ordinary kid that's a slave. He's actually very intelligent. He builds C-3PO, he knows how to build a pod racer, and can race it. Out of context, this does scream Gary Soup, but I'll explain later how this isn't actually the case. Watto isn't pleasing fella. He's hard to convince, so you have Qui-Gon bargaining and placing bets. Dude really became a gambler and hopes a kid he just met could win it all for him. I mean, he bets a ship that's the only way for him to get off this planet. I mean, Qui-Gon's just keep altering his deal with Watto and wants to free Anakin because Anakin has high metachlorine count.
This deal's getting worse all the time.
A term in which has become a stain in the Star Wars fandom. Lucky for Mr. Qui-Gon that Anakin wins the pod race, which has a neat touch to the Formula 1 races. Not surprising since George is actually a big F1 fan himself. Anakin has to leave his mom to fulfill his dream of being a Jedi, but almost gets his head taken off by Maul, who's been sent by Sidious to capture the Queen. Maul was able to intercept the transmission, figure out their location.
At last we will have revenge.
They arrive on Coruscant and we see Palpatine, who's totally not Sidious, manipulating the Queen to call for a vote of no confidence to strip Vacuum of his rights as a Chancellor, putting Sir Palpy on the pedestal for new leader of the Republic. He's planning to use the sympathy votes for the cause on Naboo to win him this position. I actually never seen the Senate to be sympathetic, to be honest. The Jedi Council haven't been informed that this new Sith Lord has emerged, and also informed that Anakin is apparently the supposed chosen one.
On your knees!
That is going to bring balance to the Force. He gets tested, and the sorrow of being separated from his mom raises questions if he's fit to be a Jedi. As Mace argues, the boy is too old to begin training, and the qualities of the dark side cloud Anakin Skywalker. You see, the Jedi took Force-sensitive children to make them Jedi and serve as peacemakers. Now, since Anakin is too old apparently, because Jedi brainwashed them at a young age, depriving them any chance of falling to the dark side. Now, this just raises questions, because Jedi in the past have turned into a more darker path. Look at Count Dooku. So why with Anakin? He's just a kid who doesn't have a broad view of the galaxy. So it's not too late for them to teach him the more clear path. Seems like a BS excuse, probably because Yoda's just jealous of Anakin Skywalker's metachlorine count. The Queen wants to go back to Naboo and free her planet. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan tag along, and Qui-Gon brings Anakin along. Why would you bring a kid to the kill zone? I get Jedi Knights bringing Padawans to dangerous missions, but the thing is, Anakin has no force powers. He's had zero training for him to defend himself in any capacity. You're playing a stupid risk game here. But the Jedi won't allow Anakin in the temple. Well, I'm sure Qui-Gon could have requested for Anakin to stay at the temple till the invasion of Naboo has ended. I'm sure the Jedi aren't dickheads.
Take a seat, young Skywalker.
It's never been done in the history of the Jedi. It's insulting.
They arrive on Naboo, and the Queen, who's revealed to be Padme, negotiates with the Gungans by begging. The Gungans fight against the droid army. Maul and Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon duel it out. Anakin accidentally blows up the Trade Federation droid control ship. I don't know why you would build an army controlled by one singular ship. Seems pretty dumb. I mean, I'm no engineer here, but that seems actually very ignorant. Maul manages to kill Qui-Gon Jinn, but gets decapitated by Obi-Wan. So that's it. So that's all we're gonna get from this character. Someone who meat rides the Emperor and looks like the demon from Sidious. New Gunray is defeated. The Jedi have authorized Obi-Wan to train Anakin. I guess they saw the miraculous stuff he did in space, and they were like, yeah, he's on the team. Gungans and the people of Naboo form peace and harmony, and they believe that the galaxy has been eliminated of the final Sith. But Yoda fears there's a darker feeling out there, someone that's not clearly under their nose.
Always two there are.
I may have gone too far in a few places.
Indeed you did, George. Where do I even begin? Yeah, the movie is a bit of snooze in areas. I've caught myself dozing off trying to make this review, but a man's gotta power through if it means suffering through some of this boredom. 95% of this film's characters are very tedious. Most have no unique traits, no inspiring background, and lack of charisma. I don't know how George Lucas directs his actors, but he makes them sound like they don't even want to be in this movie themselves.
You will not be so pleased when you hear what I have to say, Viceroy.
You see, the whole idea of adding characters into your story is that they push the plot forward, telling the story from their perspective. So if you're telling this massive story around politics and debates, which oddly can be boring for some to care, this is where characters can come in handy to really entertain this idea. Now, was it successful? Mostly not. Discussions in the Senate and the Phantom Menace sound like a normal Congress meeting. I mean, you got Padme sounding like she's part of the Addams family. Palpatine is the only interesting political figure here, considering the performance Ian McDiarmid gives. He presents the character as a schemer and very intelligent. He makes you want to actually pay attention. When it comes to the rest, there is no interest.
Boring!
This film has no consistent tone. It doesn't know itself if it wants to be serious film or a comedy. It's like you're working on a school project and there's many topics to choose from and you're stuck between two choices. You decide to go big brain move and choose both and mash them together like they're different colors of Play-Doh, hoping that it makes one singular color. But instead you make an incoherent project with no main idea presented. This is what the Phantom Menace tone feels like. In one scene you got politicians talking about an illegal invasion on Boo, then you cut to Jar Jar stepping on some turd or species farting in Jar Jar's face. It's like, is the situation supposed to be funny? I'm not laughing. Then the film just cuts to Darth Maul almost decapitating Anakin with the speeder. What the fuck? No, nothing wrong about adding comedy to your film, but just don't make it so blatant or out of touch of the scene. Just look at the Dark Knight trilogy. Each film is taken very seriously given the occurring events.
What is the point of all those push-ups if you can't even lift a bloody log?
I mean, you don't have Batman running on rooftops and oops, he steps on bird poop. Ha ha ha, I'm laughing my ass off. And 3 seconds later, he gets his back broken by Bane and the scene is now very serious and sad. Like, no, just no. Now, that's obviously an example if George Lucas directed the Dark Knight trilogy, the way he directed the Phantom Menace, but let's look at an actual example of a scene from The Dark Knight Rises. The scene with Catwoman, he makes a remark of her disappearing with his back turned, and we get this glorious line.
Miss Kyle. So that's what that feels like.
It makes sense given the context. He always disappears in conversations. It's like a line that just synchronizes well with the scene, and it just ends up being hilarious. The Phantom Menace, its way of conducting humor is very unconcealed, which kind of damages the tone it's really trying to convey.
No, Mrs. Stay. Mr. got Jar Jar Binks. Mr. your humble servant.
That won't be necessary.
This film has little to no stakes. Given the fact its main conflict in the story is Naboo has been occupied by Trade Federation, it looks big, but it doesn't present itself to be big. This has to do with the fact how villains are bestowed in this film. The droids serve zero threat, they're goofy, they get their ass beat by Jar Jar Binks, who is not even taking the battle seriously.
I'm trying.
Okay, yeah, but you can make the argument stormtroopers were just as bad. Let's look at the officials. Darth Vader was an intimidating presence that made the rebels shit their pants. Tarkin was a very commanding officer taking his job seriously, the kind of guy. Let's look at the Separatists. Newt Gunray is the biggest pussy when it comes to struggling situations, as well as his buddies. They can't make smart decisions themselves as well as being complete idiots. Like, why the fuck would you send guards chasing up presumably the real queen when you got like, I don't know, 10 hostages around you with no security backing you up? Not to mention, they have no handcuffs. What the fuck?
Not a great plan.
I don't know if I talked a lot about Maul in this video. I mean, there's nothing really to talk about. He has like 2 lines in the film. He's like the downgraded version of the Winter Soldier, but he has nothing to show for. He's your generic villain that's just thrown in there for one film and dies. He just looks cool and carries a double-bladed saber. He's a badass with no complexity to him. Thank God Filoni gave him more of a purpose and a background to his character. Comparing what he was pre-Clone Wars, the difference is night and day.
Master Qui-Gon Jinn, I gutted him while you stood helpless and watched.
I've shat on this film so far, and you're probably wondering why I put this movie as a mediocre film. Well, I don't hate this film, nor do I think it's bad. It's just mediocre. Its concepts and overall idea is very interesting and kind of cool, seeing the beginning of the rise of the Empire. It's kind of executed pretty well. Palpatine isn't a fool in this film. He plays mind games with Padme and uses her emotions to his advantage, given how she can easily be manipulated. Palpatine views this as an opening for him to take power over the Senate, and he just hits his target. He's treating it like a big chess game, he's just playing pawns on both sides. Now, before you question my sanity on this kind of take, I feel like him being a kid is pretty believable for his descent to the dark side. Remember, the Jedi pretty much brainwash you into forbidding attachments. Anakin's a curious kid who hasn't seen the galaxy. He's like 9, so he's pretty much grew an attachment with his mother, so leaving the only person in your life to this point who has loved you is like a big nail to your life. And it just hurts. Nobody accepts you besides Qui-Gon, who dies, and then there's Padme, but she's a political figure, so she isn't around too much. Getting butchered like this as a kid in like, what, I think it was a span of a week, days, just builds on his descent to being Youngling Slayer 66.
I didn't need to see that.
Many people call Anakin blowing up the ship at a young age with no training as a concept of Gary Sue. Now, out of context, this does look bad, but adding context is not really the end of the world. You gotta remember, he works at a junkyard consisted of ship parts, and has somewhat of an experience with pod racing, with building components that you would use for a ship. No, not enough justification? Okay, let's just see this scene itself. He accidentally activates the Naboo ship. He's an autopilot, so he has like no control over the ship. He fiddles with the controls, and just luck is on his side. And I mean, it is luck, since even himself, he has no clue what he's doing. And he just so happens to blow up the control ship. Yeah, I know midichlorians are an abomination to society and should have never existed, but what if I told you midichlorians aren't a bad addition to the lore? I mean, the Force still surrounds us, penetrates us, binds the galaxy together, and what the biggest complaint was, the midichlorians diminishes what Obi-Wan said and defeats the mysticism of the Force. Not really. When you really deep dive into this pool, the idea behind the midichlorians was obviously to confirm, yeah, Anakin is the chosen one, but it also gives an idea that the potential one has, and their connection to the Force. You still need to train countlessly to achieve those heights. Fuck. Nostalgia can be a big lifesaver for films from receiving an enormous amount of hate down the line. And it can also help the fact that piss-poor films released 20 years later have made this film better in comparison. This film is pretty much a diamond covered in turd. I think you could say that for the entire trilogy when looking at the overall scale. The Phantom Menace would most likely been solid and held to high regard if the direction was better, and not dull, boring, out of touch with its tone, and the horrendous effects, not aging well at all. The Phantom Menace isn't bad, it's just a victim of mediocre execution. At least it's easy to follow and you're aware of the overall story in this film. It's just hard to bypass the bad it produces. I mean, there isn't a clear protagonist the audience could connect with and follow. Anakin shows up like 50 minutes into the film, and by then it just becomes a mess. You got 3 main characters on the screen: Qui-Gon Jinn, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Anakin Skywalker. This film would probably have benefited from starting from Anakin's perspective. Kind of like how A New Hope started with Luke Skywalker and his perspective on the war and the Empire. I mean, the trilogy is centered around Anakin's descent to the dark side, so why not just take the concept I just mentioned and you just go from there? I think I've said what I need to be said about this film. There's nothing really to say that hasn't been said. Also because I got like 8 more of these to cover. So yeah, goodbye.